everybody. Welcome to Church History for Chumps. My name is John Simon. And his name is...
Back in the saddle again.
And you always got something special to do. You know that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thomas Duell, everybody. Thomas Duell. And we're back for another episode, following our series of The Early Church Gets the Worm. And we got a little banger for you guys today. Should be good. Yeah. How do you like that name, The Early Church Gets the Worm?
It's a little long. I'm thinking if we have like other things that we need to communicate about the episode.
I'm worried about that too. Yeah, maybe we'll just call it that here, but then we won't write it down because it is kind of long.
What's another kind of short early church?
Like a little pun, like
how about like the early and then like in parentheses church edition? How about that? Like the early edition. Remember that old show?
Oh, okay.
Where the guy gets like the newspaper from tomorrow every day.
Is that what happens in this show?
Do you not know about that show?
I do not.
It's a heartbreaking show because this guy, like every day, he hit the newspaper that gets delivered to his house for some unknown reason, like Groundhog Day. He's reading tomorrow's news. So it's up to him whether or not, like, if he sees that, somebody like fell off this building, and died, like. He could go help them, or he could go solve this other thing, or he could make awesome stock trades.
Zone show. Is this on like on the Homeschool Network or something?
It's got to be. I think it's from like the 80s.
Yeah,
I never watched it actually. I just know about it.
Yeah, that is strange. I've never heard anything about that. Okay, we'll stick with the early church gets the word for now. We'll just stick with that, I think. But yeah. So today we're talking about a couple of the emperors. I figured. Here's the thing. We love talking about persecution. We love talking about, so I figured let's talk about the first couple little splashes of persecution that hit the church, first century, way back in the beginning. And I figured we'll talk about that a little bit.
Sweet.
And then I have a couple cool questions. I was like, I bet you Thomas would knock these questions out of the park. So I'm going to ask him
You've thought that before.
I did. Yeah. Well, you think you're gonna drop the ball?
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, you'll never know until we try.
All right.
But I think it should be really good. We should be really good. All right. So basically, we're gonna talk about two emperors. One by the name of Nero, and one by the name of I know, and one by the name of Domitian, which is not that great of a name. Now it is worth saying, especially if you're a reader of the Book of Acts, that there was persecution that happened before the Romans got involved, but it was mostly by the Jews, because we see that in the Book of Acts that there were people who were still not vibing with this guy Jesus or his message, and so lots of the early followers of Jesus, especially in areas where there were a lot of the children of Israel, getting a lot of pushback that would at times become violent. But we're talking more like systemic persecution, more like big scale, or actually we'll see that maybe not quite as big scale as we would have thought before. So
like actually getting beat up and dying kind of stuff.
Yeah,
that's what you got in mind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, not just like, I almost feel like the persecution that happened, there was like a kind of a corrupted courts, like a corrupted judicial. I mean, just like looking at Jesus's execution did not really go according to like a fair trial system. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that was happening, but there's also just seemed like mob persecution.
Yeah, in like Peter's letters, I think it especially comes out like he's encouraging the church to bear up under persecution, but the type of persecution at that time was more like they just weren't fitting into the social fabric of the Roman Empire anymore.
Yeah,
and, like you weren't getting invited to the parties.
Exactly. So we'll start off with this guy by the name of Nero. Now Nero is like, I don't know. I almost said I like Nero. I don't like Nero. Yeah, your face was like, huh? Nero's a very interesting dude to me because he becomes emperor in 54 AD. So this is, literally within like 20 years of Jesus's passing. So this is really, really, really early in the church history time period. He was the nephew of the Emperor Claudius, and I think there was like some weird shenanigans where like his mom married Claudius, so he was like kind of adopted into like the imperial lineage, but he wasn't born into it. So Nero kind of became the heir and the emperor eventually because of some wheeling and dealing that his mom did. Because when his adopted dad Claudius would die, he would take over as the emperor. I also think he became emperor when he was like super young. Yeah, I think he was
born in 37. So.
Yeah, he was born in 37. So he was emperor when he was like 16 or 17. And so Nero is an interesting dude because I think that the combination of his mom's influence and kind of the shady way that he became the emperor, and then just the fact that he had this like love for opulence. Like he was known as a very like over the top, like very, like I think one of the historians has this quote that's like, there was no pleasure that Nero did not like seek out for himself. He was just like a very like over the top, like always the best of stuff, and had no like second thought for just like pleasure seeking.
I mean, being 16 or 17 was pretty hard on Justin Bieber. Can you imagine if we had made him emperor of the world?
That's a fantastic point. The fact that this dude just inherited everything at the age, and he was like a junior in high school.
Yeah.
Like there's not a junior in the world that I would want to be my emperor. And so interestingly, like Nero becomes like universally disliked because of the way that he carries himself, much like Justin Bieber in his late teens and early 20s.
Yeah.
Nobody really wants to see the cute kid, just get the world. Nobody likes the guy. Also, I say that like there were a couple of the busts of Nero that literally looked like he has like a neck beard, which I thought was hysterical.
Yeah, dude, they were clowning him.
Oh, dude, yeah.
It's like the antiquity version of a meme.
Yeah, 100%. And so like that's what to me is so interesting about Nero is the fact that because he's so disliked, there's not a lot of reliability for the historical retellings of his life because there were a lot of people who clearly wanted to make him look like a scumbag, and he may have been like a scumbag junior, but people are making him out to be like the most like sadistic, like psychopathic dude ever. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more. But the big thing that really shifts Nero's kind of trajectory as emperor was the Great Fire. There's a huge fire that breaks out, and actually on July 18th, which is today, Thomas.
Wow.
It means nothing for you listeners because you're not going to hear this today. But for us, hey, that's so cool. You guys should be happy for me and Thomas right now. July 18th, 64 AD, the Great Fire broke out, and
in Rome.
It blazed through the city for 6 days. And it took nearly 10 days to fully go out. And of the 14, essentially sections of the city, 10 of them were almost completely destroyed.
Dang.
So it was a massive, massive disaster. Now, because Nero was pretty much a universally disliked dude who was seen as extremely selfish, as very narcissistic, as an impulsive dude who couldn't be trusted, this rumor starts to spread that Nero was the cause of the fire. You're smirking.
It's the Bush
now.
did 9/11 of the first century.
Dude, that's good. Your parallels right now are just sharp as a tack. I love that, dude. Yeah, it was like the jet fuel can't burn Greek columns, essentially. Yeah. But yeah, there were basically these parallel rumors that happened. One was that Nero had legitimately gone mad. He was just an insane person, and he started the fire himself. And the other was that he knew he was perfectly fine with the fire happening because he was excited to rebuild the city to be more and more of like a monument to his legacy as emperor.
Wow.
So the two prevailing opinions were either he did it because he's crazy or he did it because he's a narcissist who doesn't care about anyone but himself. But his PR is atrocious. And of course we have that kind of literally probably a meme, this idea that Nero was playing the liar while Rome burned. This image of like him on like the tops of these giant buildings with this huge blaze behind him, and he's just playing the Freebird guitar solo or something. And so yeah, there's more.
Nero
and more.
Definitely would have vaped.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I bet you he like zinned. I bet you he vaped. I bet he had like a couple
wasn't
cigars.
Cool enough to zin.
I don't know. I think he was just cool enough to zin. Also, is zinning is that the verb people are using, or is it like do zin?
No, yeah, zinning and winning.
Ugh, sounds pretty close to sin for me, bro. I don't know. That's.
I've heard a lot of "Bless me, Father, for I've," or "Forgive me, Father, for I've zinned."
That's unbearable. Oh my gosh. So we have our boy Nero. Obviously, he's already historically, this is already a pretty contentious time for emperors, and he is very, very much disliked right now. And the biggest city in the world just had this tremendous fire, and everyone thinks it's his fault. So he realizes, I need to find someone to blame for this. I need myself a scapegoat. And this is where we get to the historian Tacitus, who has a couple of really, really vivid quotes. I'll read a couple of them here. Here's the first one. And I think there's some really interesting insight that we can get from both of these quotes, but I'll start here. So, in spite of every human efforts of the emperor's largesse and of the sacrifices made to the gods, nothing sufficed to allay suspicion nor to destroy the opinion that the fire had been ordered. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians, who are hated for their abominations, and punished them with refined cruelty. Christ, from whom they take their name, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Stopped for a moment, this evil superstition reappeared, not only in Judea, where was the root of the evil, but also in Rome, where all things sordid and abominable from every corner of the world come together. Thus, first those who confessed that they were Christians were arrested, and on the basis of their testimony, a great number were condemned, although not so much for the fire itself as for their hatred of humankind.
This is like genocide 101. Blood libel, then start killing the people that you don't like.
Yeah, pretty much. They were like, well, we can make things better if we sacrifice to the gods, and that didn't seem to be helping for them. What's interesting is Tacitus is writing this as a pretty neutral party as a historian, but it's very clear the way that he refers to Christians that he does not like Christians either. And I think that's really interesting because it's really playing into this idea that there was a pre-existing prejudice. This wasn't Nero just being like, oh yeah, the Christians, whatever. But Nero was playing on a pre-existing prejudice that oh, let's see, who sucks in this empire? Oh yeah, the Christians. And history says that of the 4 regions that were not destroyed by the fire, 2 of them had a really significant Jewish and Christian population, which kind of fed into this speculation that these groups that we don't trust definitely started the fire. Yeah. So that leads to some pretty graphic depictions. I'll read one of the more famous ones here. Before killing the Christians, Nero used them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in furs to be killed by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were set on fire early in the night so that they might illuminate it. Nero opened his gardens for these shows, and in the circus he himself became a spectacle, for he mingled with the people dressed as a charioteer, or he rode around in his chariot. All of this aroused the people, even against these culprits who deserved an exemplary punishment, for it was clear that they were not being destroyed for the common good, but rather to satisfy the cruelty of one person. So yeah, that is a very famous image, especially if you've heard anything about some of the early persecutions. Really, the biggest one that's always stood with me was Christians basically being used as lanterns.
Yeah.
Kind of put
like
up
a little
on
garden party with human candles.
Yeah, pretty wild. And so the interesting thing is that these, like, again, Nero being as disliked as he was and having so many enemies, so there is a little bit of dispute amongst historians on if what we're hearing from Tacitus is actually reliable. And one of the criticisms I thought was actually really interesting, which was that it's unlikely that Nero would be able to distinguish the Jews and Christians, because at this point in history, the Romans really didn't have a clear distinction for the two of them. They were both very similar in that they worshipped an invisible God and that they worshipped once a week. Like they had so many overlapping rituals, it was unlikely that Nero knew to distinguish the two of them. And it's possible, just because Tacitus is the only historian who reports on these things, that he was exaggerating the cruelty to really make Nero come across again like a scumbag. So it's not 100% sure. I think it's likely that there was a persecution and maybe that the details were exaggerated, because this is most likely when two of the most famous martyrs of church history ever occurred, which was the beheading of the Apostle Paul and the upside down crucifixion of St. Peter. And so it is
probably both in Rome.
Both in Rome, and most likely during the persecution of Nero. So I don't think, from what I've seen, I don't think that there's much to say that this persecution never happened. I think it is possible that historical records are exaggerated, but I mean, he killed Christians for sure.
Yeah. Well, it would align. There's a lot of like in a partial preterist reading of the Book of Revelation, there's a lot of the imagery that's there is written to help Christians at the time identify like the beast of Rome with Nero. And helping Christians see like Nero's gonna do some bad stuff, but here's what's coming next.
Exactly. So Nero is considered the first Antichrist of the apostolic era, or just the early church. He's considered the first Antichrist, and he was the first Roman leader, and the first, I guess you could say, like state-led persecution of Christians, which is really, really significant.
Yeah.
Another thing is that the scale of this was most likely very small. This persecution most likely did not happen outside of the city of Rome itself.
Okay.
So when you compare it to some of the persecutions that we're going to get to later, which are across the empire and are going to be massive, this one's relatively small. But it is setting a very interesting precedent, which is that the head figure of the Roman Empire is recognizing that Christians are his opponents and are opponents to the greater well-being of the empire. That's a recurring trend we're going to see, which is really interesting. Our next dude is going to come about 20 years later. Oh, also I should say, the persecution of Nero fizzled out in about 68 AD because there was a coup and he killed himself. And when I forget who took over after him, they were basically like, I don't care about Christians, whatever.
Yeah. Well, there was I think there was, after Nero, 4 emperors in the span of like a year.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah.
Which is also prophesied in the Book of Revelation.
And they're all going to kill each other, basically. It's like a huge period of unrest for them. That's a good point. So after Nero, actually that might be right before Nero, the year of the 4 emperors. I'm not sure. I want to look that up.
I think it's after, because I think that he dies, there's the year of the 4 emperors, and then there's AD 70.
Oh, you know what? You're right. It was 69 AD was the year of the 4, and then Vespasian is going to take over, and he'll be, I think Vespasian is emperor right before Titus, and Titus is the one who will destroy the temple. Yeah.
Yep.
So both Vespasian and Titus are going to have more issues with the Jews than with the Christians, and we've talked about that in the past episode.
If you the Jewish wars are going on right now.
Yeah, and that's going to result in, basically, if you remember the distinction of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots are going to be the ones who are most antagonistic to Rome. Well, their movement is going to explode in popularity around this time, and there's basically going to be a series of like civil wars where the Jews are going to fight, and that's going to lead to an absolute apocalypse of a situation, which is the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in AD 70. And so the next emperor we're going to talk about is this dude by the name of Domitian, and Domitian is kind of inheriting the aftermath of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And so his persecution is gonna look a little different than Nero's, and because Nero seemed to have a very clear kind of cause and effect between the fire and the persecution, it's not clearly stated why Domitian started to kind of push against the Christians, but it's believed that Domitian had a deep love for the Roman religion and Roman customs, and so
consequently his busts look a lot better than Nero.
I was gonna point out Domitian was a handsome guy.
Yeah,
he was a handsome
no
dude.
neck beard in sight.
No neck beard. No, man. No Cheeto crumbs scattered around his lips or anything. Like, but dude, Domitian, I was like, man, this guy looks sharp, dude. So not 100% sure why the persecution started, but the dude loved the Roman religion and Roman customs, and so of course he would become frustrated with those who intentionally abstained from it.
So when you say the Roman religion, are you specifically talking about like the Caesar cult?
I would say the Caesar cult, but also the cults of the various Roman gods, like making the sacrifices at the temples and things like that. But probably both, honestly, probably both. A thing that I read that I thought was interesting was that so for a long time, the Jews in Rome had to pay these super excessive taxes to for the temple to be upheld, and I think Domitian, as an emperor, basically expected, since the temple was no longer in existence, that the Jews would take that taxation and basically send it to Rome instead. And the Jews were like, no, we're not going to do that just because you destroyed like the most important monument in our religion. So there's obviously still some residual effects of the conflict between the Romans and the Jews, and so that leads to another wave of persecution, which again, since Christianity and Judaism at that time didn't have a clear separation in the eyes of the Romans, they're persecuting both of them. And so those who are basically
I never knew that. That's super fascinating.
Yeah, so basically those who are seen as abstaining from the Roman traditions, rituals, customs of sacrifice are going to be lumped into this camp and persecuted, because, and I read something else that was interesting, which was because Christians and Jews both served who they believed was like an invisible God, because there weren't statues and like visible creations of it, they would refer to them as atheists, because they were like, well, you guys don't believe in our pantheon, but you're also worshiping in a literally invisible God. So they like mocked them as being like very superstitious and very like kind of silly like that. But what we see in Domitian that I think is very, very interesting, because again, we're going to see it more and more as we look at Roman emperors, is this idea that to be a Christian is not to be a good Roman. Like, if you're a Christian, you're compromising your Roman self, your Roman culture. And various emperors are going to have different feelings about this, but for some, to be a good Roman and to do what Romans do is very, very important. And so that's going to become kind of this like linchpin for them, which is interesting. Domitian's also going to unfortunately get kind of a sour reputation, and he's going to be killed in a kind of an uprising. The story of his murder is also really interesting, dude, because I guess what had happened was, so he's starting to get paranoid because he's thinking that there are people who are starting to conspire against him. And I also thought about the intimate nature of how assassinations worked in this time, because you can't shoot at somebody from across the street in Rome. Like, if you want to kill somebody, you basically have to get close enough, and to get close to an emperor, you have to be someone who's trusted. So like, when these assassinations happened, like, it's kind of memeified with Julius Caesar and Brutus, like him being like his best friend. But like, it kind of has to be a betrayal if you're gonna go down.
Real knife in the back.
Literally. Yeah. And so Domitian was starting to get paranoid because he felt like people were starting to conspire against him, and he had heard an oracle that the time of his death was going to be at midday. And so he's like walking around the courts in Rome, and there's a servant nearby, and he asks the servant what time it is, and the servant, who was in on the assassination attempt, told him, oh, it's well into the afternoon, to kind of like let his guard down.
Oh, no way.
And later on, one of Domitian's I guess advisors comes in, and he had for the past several days been faking like an arm injury so that he could have his arm kind of in a sling, so that on the day that he came in, he could keep a dagger concealed. And so he came in with his like fake little arm sling, and then he went after Domitian.
Classic.
And then clapped him.
Wow.
So and he did die at midday, just like the prophecy foretold.
Wow.
So I feel like those little legends of like Roman emperor stuff, some of it might be kind of hokey, but it is really interesting. I don't know. That's an interesting story.
Fascinating.
And again, that time of persecution kind of came to an end. But as I was thinking through this, man, I had a question that I thought I'd like to hear the opinion of the good Dr. Duell about this. This idea that we see in a lot of history is like, especially in places of persecution. I think a lot of that movie Silence, which is the persecution of the like Japanese Christians in Japan, like there's this concept that like Christianity doesn't grow here. Like Japan and Christianity don't resonate with one another. And Domitian is saying the same thing. Like Rome is not the place where Christianity is going to prosper, which is a hilarious thing to think of in hindsight, considering that Rome and Christianity are now like synonymous with each other. But like, how do you answer that philosophical idea that like Christianity is not for Rome? Or even like, imagine you're counseling somebody and they're like, I don't know, dude, I'm an American and I just don't feel like Christianity really vibes with who I am as an American. Like, how do you feel yourself responding to that?
Okay, so we're talking about like someone who has a hard time
like reconciling the Christian faith with maybe their national identity.
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, that's like a hot button question.
Yeah.
I think that we can gain quite a bit of understanding of like a citizen's posture when we read both Jesus's words about our relationship to the state, but also the Psalms. I would really want to emphasize for a Christian the reality that that there's a true dual citizenship to their existence. When you're adopted into the family of God, you are now a part of a royal nation of royal priests. You are a son or a daughter of God. Your first allegiance and identity is always going to be to God. We talked last time about Sergius and Bacchus that were, faithful. They were faithful soldiers in the Roman army that did their job well, and they, had been promoted because of it. But at the end of the day, when it came down to, are you going to sacrifice and worship Jupiter, or are you going to worship Jesus? They're like, well, it's going to be Jesus. So there's that element where it's like, just because you are a part of, well, the very language that Peter uses talking to people at this time is that of resident alien. So like, which sounds like an oxymoron, you know, like you're here, this is actually your home, you know, where you live, this is your homeland, but you also, there's an alien element to your existence here, and that your first allegiance lies in the kingdom of God. The Psalms talk about, Psalm 2 in particular is addressed to kings and rulers, and talks about God's position towards kings and rulers. And the warning to kings and rulers is to kiss the Son lest he break you with his rod of iron. And so I think to a Christian who is either struggling to see how they could fit into their nation, or is overemphasizing their allegiance to the nation that they live in, stick with the language of the Psalms, which puts us in a position to, well, we're taught to pray for our rulers and authorities, but we're also taught, as we pray the Psalms, to remind those who are in authority that if they don't submit themselves to Christ, then your nation will be broken. And it's interesting when we look at the history of Rome, like you said, you know, the ultimate trajectory is going to be one in which Christianity and Rome are one and the same.
Right.
And the way that happened was by generation after generation after century of Christians faithfully living in Rome in a cultural setting that was really hostile to Christianity at times, like you're saying. And ultimately what happened is that the reordering of society that came about through the gospel of the kingdom ends up breaking Rome at the knees, which I think is a fulfillment of the words of Psalm 2. Rome was broken with a rod of iron. But what that didn't mean is that that the Christians living in that place were the ones swinging the rod of iron.
Right.
Jesus does that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it is perfectly acceptable to love your nation, to pray for the prosperity of your nation, to identify with your nation, but it has to be within the broader missional context of like why you're in that nation in the first place, which is to baptize and disciple that nation, which is what Jesus tells us to do.
Yeah.
Did that answer what you were getting at?
I think a little bit. I think I
may have misunderstood your question.
No, it's okay. I'm gonna answer it, and then I'll let you kind of jump back in if you want to. I still think you said some good stuff, so I didn't want to interrupt. But I think what I appreciate about the gospel is that, to me, it gives a backbone of heritage to the areas in which grace has kind of touched the human culture around us. Because if someone says to me, yeah, I'm an American, like I believe in liberties, I believe in freedoms, I believe in, you know, the pursuit of happiness, I believe in, you know, all men are created equal, like, and I want to be able to look at that guy and say, like, yes, like, and I believe that the gospel and like the good news of Jesus Christ actually gives weight to those words and gives weight to that concept. Like, I believe that, like, when we apply the gospel to our national identity, we can see kind of like light breaking through where grace has already been, and then we can also see the darkness kind of peel away too, where there's like things within our culture and our identity that have been like harmful and destructive. Because, you know, for Domitian to say like, well, this isn't who Rome is, like Rome is a people of order, and we're a people of peace, and we're a people who serve Jupiter and who serve the pantheon. Like, a Christian can look at that and say, like, we're not here to disturb peace. We love peace. We serve the Prince of Peace. Like, we serve the God who is calling all of disorder into order, and who is calling all of creation into, the harmony that it was created for. But we're also called to serve the God who made that. And we're also called to, like you said, like we kiss the cross. Like, that is because that is the center of our universe. And so, to say that, like, I've realized kind of over the years that to say that, because I think that I've wrestled with that in my own personal relationships with people who don't believe in Jesus, being able to say, like, I don't know how this faith is relatable to this person and where they are. Like, I don't know if Jesus has anything to offer this person who is a video editor living in California who likes craft beer and plays, PUBG on the weekends. Like, I don't know what Jesus has to offer. Like, if someone who's already living a pretty peaceful, mundane life. But I think that when we realize that, like, there is something like, I think we've talked about this a little bit with Brad, but like the idea that there's always going to be a stumbling block when Christ enters into a culture, but it's often because that Jesus is offering a fulfillment to that. Like, the Greeks are going to wrestle with Jesus because they're philosophers, but guess who illuminates light over philosophy? Christ does. Like, the Jews are going to wrestle with Jesus because, he's a cursed man on a tree, but he's also going to be life to our death. Like, that's illuminating. So, there's all these ways in which they kind of interact with each other, and I think that's interesting. But, this concept that Rome doesn't have room for this Jesus guy. I thought that was an interesting thing to hear.
Yeah. I think that the Romans were, especially in the first century, still trying to like figure out like what is the trajectory of this Christian stuff. And as time goes on, we get to later emperors. Was it Diocletian? I can't remember which emperor has that famous line where he's just like, these guys are like beating us at our own game. Like they're taking better care of the poor in Rome than we are, and it makes me think of Peter when he's writing to towards the end of his life, and he's writing to people who are like, the persecution's starting to notch up a little bit, and he says in 1 Peter 3, he says, who's going to harm you if you're eager to do good?
Right.
But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it's God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. I feel like for Domitian, as he's considering like whether or not Christianity has a place in Rome, like the project's just getting started. Right. As time goes on, I think it's going to become more clear to the Romans, like, okay, like this thing's not going away. And there's something to what they're doing, which is why ultimately we're going to get to a Christian emperor.
Yeah. For a second, I thought you were talking about like, today we're going to get to a Christian emperor, and I was gonna be like, dude, you can't say stuff like that. This is not a post-mill podcast.
Oh, that's funny.
He's like, and that's why pretty soon there's gonna be a Christian emperor sitting over the United States of America.
There is a Christian emperor right now.
His name is Jesus.
That's right.
That's right. His name is Joseph R. Biden. Just kidding. I don't really know what his middle name is, actually. Yeah, so I don't know. I kind of like this. We'll do a second century persecution pretty soon. Things are going to amp up, and they're going to amp down for a long time.
Yeah. So something I'm not sure if I caught from you is was the persecution under Domitian, was it beyond the gates of Rome?
It was a little bit. Okay. I believe that it was mostly Rome and Asia Minor. So it did have a little bit more kind of a wingspan than Nero's. And I think that's interesting. Like, I think that there's going to be a continued kind of like expansion outward. Because I think it's widely considered that Diocletian, who you mentioned earlier, he is going to have the most oppressive persecution of throughout the Roman Empire, but it's also the last one because he's going to be succeeded by a guy named Constantine, who's going to change everything.
Something I just thought of, like, you kind of sitting in the position of a Roman emperor, like, what do you do, especially as the church gets going? Like when we got to when we did our Lawrence the Deacon episode, we talked about like how in Antioch just the sheer amount of like church officers there was between like the presbyters, the bishop, the deacons, the exorcists. Like there was like hundreds of people that were part of the like this structure. Like any other, if you're a Roman emperor and you find out that there is this like order that has like this tiered authority, but then like that would be potentially like a dangerous thing. Like that seems like it's like an unsanctioned like government that's popping up in your territory. But then the more you look at it, you realize they're governing over like spiritual affairs. And the things that they are doing are the authority that these people are using is not an authority that they're using to lord over other people, but for their benefit. Like that's such a like a type breaker for these Roman emperors, that I'm sure was really hard to like figure out what in the world is going on here.
Oh yeah, I think that is definitely a thing, and I also think, I mean, I wish I had said this earlier because it feels like almost too much to kind of throw at the end here, but persecution is going to shape the culture of the church in such a tremendous way. Like I often think back on our episode of Polycarp, and his martyrdom that happened, actually may have happened under Domitian, now that I think about it, but I'm not sure. Because he was, do you remember the year that he was martyred?
I think it was after the year 100.
You're right.
I think it's probably after Domitian.
Yeah, may have been a different guy. But like when I think of, because when we think of, because we've talked a lot about the monastics and the ascetics, the people who have gone into the wilderness and who have, made these vows to kind of live these very small kind of self-depriving lives of worship to God. That whole movement started because the persecutions ended, because Christianity throughout its, short history at that time had identified that persecution wasn't just an obstacle for their like global takeover, but it was an active like posture of worship. And what I thought was so beautiful, the more I reflect on the story of Polycarp, is that in his death and in the telling of his death that his followers had, it wasn't like, holy smokes, they got Polycarp, let's go get those Roman punks. But it was like this incredible moment of peaceful, like, God has called his faithful servant home, and if only we could be so lucky to walk in the footsteps of the martyrs before us. Like, to me, something I would love to just soak in for a while is the posture of the Christians of these early centuries towards the martyrs. Because when we think about this, it would be completely crazy that if someone of our churches, if a pastor that we respect was just like strung up and crucified upside down, that we would just be like, praise God, dude. Like, what a beautiful blessing that God saw him fit to walk in the footsteps of Jesus like that. Like, it's so incredibly countercultural and beautiful in that way. And so when we think of the persecutions, we shouldn't think of them as like this was a dark time of the church. The church didn't even think it was a dark time. They actually saw this as a time where they were really living out their faith. So much so that we do have problems like the Donatist controversy, where they're going to say, actually, if you didn't get martyred, you're a punk.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
So it's interesting. Like the way that the spirit of martyrdom and persecution really shaped this, like, your value as a Christian is in how much of your life you can give just remarkable. It's so interesting.
It does seem like the Spirit of God makes that happen in the moments of persecution, against all odds, against our flesh, against our desires to retaliate. That in those moments the Spirit of God speaks. I can think of two modern examples in kind of like ascending severity, starting with the lesser one. There's a video, I forget what the pastor's name is, but there's this heart-wrenching video from, I think it was during 2020. There's a pastor in Canada that was being arrested for, I'm not sure what he did. I think he like had a prayer service at his house or something, and these Canadian cops are there to arrest him, and it's heartbreaking because he's got like a bunch of kids, and like his kids are all crying as he's getting arrested, but like just like the peaceful way that he engages with the cops that were, I guess I don't fully understand Canadian law, but I think the cops were probably breaking the law. And just he's appealing to them. He's not like laying down and just being like, not putting up a fight as far as like trying to discuss and engage with them, but he's just like very peaceful and loving to them in that moment, which has a far-reaching witness past that. Another one that's way more severe is, have you ever seen that? I think you probably have. Have you seen the video of those Coptic widows? Oh my gosh. There's this, maybe we'll drop it as a link on our Insta story or something soon so you all can watch it. But there's this powerful video from, I think it was within the last 7 or 8 years, but ISIS had beheaded a bunch of Coptic Christian men, and a reporter was interviewing their wives like the day of, and what these women have to say is astonishing. I'm not even going to try to like repeat what they said, but like their posture towards those who murdered their husbands, and like the glory that they give to Christ in that moment it's incredible. It's really cool.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. All right, well, we'll have lots more time to talk about persecution in the future, so we'll try to cover the 2nd century pretty soon. But anyways, thanks for hanging out with us, you guys.
Yeah,
we'll see you next time.
God bless you.